The jungle was the weapon, every shadow a threat, every step a gamble, every breath measured against the sound of leaves rustling in a wind that might not be wind at all. American soldiers in Vietnam didn't just fight an enemy. They fought the earth itself, weaponized by an adversary who understood that you don't need to win battles to win wars. You just need to make your enemy bleed until they choose to leave. This is the story of how the Viet Cong turned asymmetry into advantage, how they transformed terrain into traps, villages into fortresses, and the human mind into the ultimate battlefield. We're going to break down 3 tactical pillars that define this ghost war. The guerrilla doctrine that rejected conventional battle, the booby trap network that turned every patrol into psychological torture, and the prisoner of war camps that weaponized capture itself. By the end, you'll understand exactly how a force with inferior firepower, no air support, and equipment dating back to World War II managed to grind down the most powerful military on Earth. But first, we need to understand the fundamental mismatch. The United States military in 1965 arrived in Vietnam prepared to fight World War II in the jungle. Massive formations, overwhelming firepower, clear front lines, decisive engagements. The Viet Cong had studied that playbook and decided to tear it up. They had watched the French lose at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, not because the French weren't brave or well-equipped, but because they let themselves be fixed in place and surrounded. The lesson was clear: never give the Americans a target worth hitting. Instead, the Viet Cong embraced what Mao Zedong called People's War. The doctrine was elegant in its simplicity. The population is the sea, and the guerrilla swims in it like a fish. You don't hold territory in neat lines on a map. You control it in patches, like leopard spots scattered across the countryside. During the day, government forces might patrol a village. At night, it belongs to the guerrilla. The local farmer who bows to the South Vietnamese official at noon might be planting mines by moonlight. This created a geographic nightmare for American and South Vietnamese forces. Imagine trying to secure a country where control doesn't radiate out from cities in predictable zones, but flickers on and off like scattered lights. A map of Vietnam in 1967 would show concentrated government control in major cities and bases, surrounded by contested zones where neither side could claim permanent authority, and then large swaths of countryside that effectively operated as Viet Cong rear areas. But these zones weren't static. They shifted based on time of day, strength of local cadres, and whether a battalion was nearby. The North Vietnamese Army provided the backbone. Regular soldiers, properly trained and equipped, would stage major operations when strategic opportunities arose. But the daily grinding work of the war, the constant erosion of American and South Vietnamese will, that fell to local Viet Cong guerrillas. Part-time fighters who knew every trail, every village elder, every safe house. They weren't trying to win pitched battles. They were trying to make the cost of occupation unbearable. Now let's talk about the rules of this ghost war, because conventional military thinking completely failed to account for what the Viet Cong actually set out to do. Traditional armies fight for terrain. They mass forces, seek decisive engagement, destroy the enemy's ability to resist and occupy ground. The Viet Cong flipped this entirely. Their objective wasn't to hold Saigon or defeat the 1st Cavalry Division in open battle. Their objective was to make South Vietnam ungovernable, to make every government official, every village chief, every police officer feel permanently insecure, and to make the American public question whether any of this was worth the cost. The tactical doctrine broke down into clear principles. First, avoid decisive battles at all costs unless victory is assured and the strategic gain outweighs the risk. If an enemy force is stronger, you fade away. You don't defend ground for honor or prestige. Ground means nothing. Survival and erosion of enemy will means everything. Second, constantly harass through small unit actions. Ambush a patrol, mortar a fire base at 3 in the morning. Snipe at a convoy. Then disappear before reinforcements arrive. Each action might only kill or wound a handful of soldiers, but multiply that across thousands of incidents over years, and you create a bleeding ulcer that never heals. Third, attack the local government infrastructure to prevent pacification. This was perhaps the most brutal aspect of the strategy. Village chiefs who cooperated with Saigon were assassinated. Teachers in government schools were killed as examples. The message was clear. Collaboration brings death, and the government cannot protect you. Research on insurgent tactics during this period documented systematic campaigns of murder and intimidation targeting anyone who represented South Vietnamese authority in rural areas. The goal wasn't random terror. It was calculated, make it impossible for Saigon to extend legitimate governance into the countryside. And fourth, drag the war out until the enemy loses the will to continue. Time was the weapon. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese leadership understood that they didn't need to conquer South Vietnam by force if they could outlast American public support for the war. Every casualty report on the evening news, every month without clear progress, every promise of light at the end of the tunnel that proved false, these all worked in favor of Hanoi. The American military could win every major battle and still lose the war if the war itself became unsustainable politically. This approach had historical precedent and theoretical backing. Communist insurgency doctrine developed through the Chinese Civil War and refined in wars of decolonization emphasized the primacy of political objectives over military ones. You're not trying to annihilate the enemy army. You're trying to collapse their political will. The battlefield is secondary to the political landscape back home in Washington and in the contested villages of the Mekong Delta. So what did this look like on the ground for an American infantryman? It meant that every patrol was a gamble. Every tree line could hide snipers. Every path could be mined. Every village might be friendly in the morning and hostile by evening. There was no front line to orient yourself by, no rear area that was truly safe. Bases got mortared. Supply convoys got ambushed. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. This brings us to the second pillar of the Viet Cong strategy, weaponizing the wild. And specifically, the use of booby traps to turn the terrain itself into a weapon that required no soldiers to operate, no supply lines to maintain, and created a constant psychological burden on every single patrol. Booby traps accounted for a staggering percentage of American casualties in certain areas and time periods. Estimates vary, but in some units and regions, particularly early in American involvement, traps and mines caused roughly 20% of casualties. 20%. 1 in 5 soldiers killed or wounded not by an enemy combatant, but by a device planted hours, days, or weeks earlier, often constructed from scavenged materials, sometimes triggered by the victim's own movement. But the brilliance of the trap network wasn't primarily about the casualties, though those were significant. It was about psychological warfare. Think about the mental calculus of walking point on a patrol. You're at the front of the column, machete in one hand, rifle in the other, pushing through dense jungle where visibility extends maybe 10 feet. Every step might trigger a mine. Every vine you push aside might release a trap. Every depression in the trail might hide stakes. You can't move quickly because speed means missing signs of danger. But you can't move too slowly because your unit has an objective and a timeline. This tension, maintained for hours every day across months of deployment, shredded nerves. Let's break down how these traps actually work, starting with the simplest and most psychologically effective, the punji stake pit. Take a shallow pit, maybe 2 feet deep and 3 feet across. Line the bottom with sharpened bamboo stakes. Bamboo is everywhere in Vietnam, costs nothing, and when properly prepared can be incredibly hard and sharp. The stakes are angled upward so that when a boot breaks through the camouflaged covering of leaves and dirt, the stakes penetrate the foot and lower leg. But here's where it gets more sophisticated. The Viet Cong would often smear the stakes with human or animal feces. The immediate injury might not be fatal, but infection in the jungle environment could be catastrophic. Even with antibiotics and medevac, the wounded soldier is out of action for weeks or months. And here's the strategic part. A dead soldier requires 1 body bag and 1 letter home. A maimed soldier requires a medic to treat him, soldiers to carry him to an LZ, a helicopter to extract him, a field hospital to stabilize him, and a flight to a rear area hospital. A single trap victim consumes enormous resources and slows down the entire unit. Now multiply this across thousands of trails. The Viet Cong didn't need to trap every path. They just needed to trap enough of them, randomly enough, that soldiers assumed every path could be trapped. The psychological weight of that assumption was itself a weapon. The next level of sophistication was the tripwire grenade trap. The Viet Cong had access to grenades, sometimes Soviet or Chinese supplied, sometimes captured from American or South Vietnamese forces. Take a standard fragmentation grenade, pull the pin, Use the tension of the spoon held down by a small stake and fishing line, then string the line across a trail at ankle or shin height. When someone trips the line, it pulls the stake, releases the spoon, and you have 4 seconds before detonation. The beauty of this from a guerrilla perspective is that it's self-initiating and indiscriminate. It doesn't require a soldier to be present. It doesn't create a signature that artillery can target. It just sits there waiting for hours or days until someone triggers it or a sweep team finds and disarms it. And if it doesn't get triggered, you can recover it and use it again. A common variant placed the grenade inside a bamboo tube or tin can mount it to a tree at torso or head height. The explosion becomes more directional, and the container adds fragmentation. Walk past and trip the line, the grenade goes off at center mass instead of at your feet. Casualties are more likely to be fatal rather than just debilitating. Then you get into the truly creative and horrifying traps. The bamboo whip. Imagine a young bamboo tree, flexible and strong, bent back with tension and held by a trigger mechanism similar to the grenade trap. Attached to the bent bamboo are stakes or blades. When triggered, the bamboo whips across the trail at high speed, impaling or slashing whoever triggered it. Sometimes these were placed at chest height, sometimes lower, sometimes aimed to swing upward from ground level. Another variant used crossbow mechanisms. Simple wooden frames mounted in trees or concealed in underbrush with taut cords holding arrows or stakes under tension. Trip the release and projectiles fire across the trail. Again, the sophistication isn't in the technology. It's in the understanding of human psychology and the economics of guerrilla warfare. These devices cost almost nothing to construct, require no logistics chain, and create effects vastly disproportionate to their material cost. Some accounts describe the use of poison stakes or even the deliberate placement of venomous snakes in trap configurations. While the prevalence of snake traps is debated and possibly exaggerated in some soldier accounts, the fact that soldiers believed they might encounter such things contributed to the psychological burden. Whether or not every reported bamboo viper in a pit was deliberately placed, the possibility shaped behavior and fed anxiety. The Viet Cong documented these techniques in training materials and field manuals. Trap construction was taught systematically, with variations designed for different terrain and different effects. Some traps were designed to kill. Others were explicitly designed to maim because maimed soldiers create a larger logistical burden and are more effective at demoralizing units. This wasn't sadism for its own sake. It was calculated strategic thinking about how to maximize the impact of limited resources. For the American soldier, this created an environment of constant vigilance that was impossible to sustain at full intensity. You can't maintain maximum alertness for 8 hours a day across a 12-month deployment. Attention fatigues, and the moment attention lapses, someone steps wrong. The randomness of it, the fact that the same trail you walked safely yesterday might be trapped today, meant there was no way to develop complete confidence in your environment. Every patrol reinforced the lesson that the jungle wanted you dead. This psychological dimension was fully understood and deliberately exploited. Documents from the period show that Viet Cong leadership recognized trap networks as a means of inflicting steady casualties. Yes, but also as a way of slowing enemy movement, forcing caution, degrading unit cohesion, and creating an atmosphere of dread. The goal was to make American soldiers feel that Vietnam itself was hostile, that the land was the enemy as much as any person with a rifle. Now we come to the third pillar, the war for the mind, and what happened when American servicemen were captured and became prisoners of war. Because if the battlefield was a psychological crucible, captivity became something even more calculated and more devastating. The Viet Cong, and especially the North Vietnamese Army, operated POW camps that were designed not primarily as holding facilities, but as engines of propaganda and psychological warfare. The treatment of American prisoners of war in North Vietnam is one of the most documented and brutal aspects of the conflict. Prisoners were held in facilities like Ho Lo Prison in Hanoi, which American POWs sardonically nicknamed the Hanoi Hilton. Conditions were deliberately harsh. Solitary confinement in tiny cells, minimal food, no medical care for injuries sustained during capture or in the camps themselves. Torture was systematic, not sporadic or the result of rogue guards, but directed and purposeful. The North Vietnamese had clear objectives with their POW program. First, extract military intelligence. troop movements, targeting plans, capabilities. Second, force prisoners to make propaganda statements condemning American involvement in the war, praising the North Vietnamese cause, and confessing to war crimes. These statements would be broadcast on radio, filmed for documentaries, and used to demoralize American forces and influence public opinion domestically and internationally. Third, break the prisoners psychologically so they could be used as tools even after repatriation. The methods of torture were varied and brutal. Beatings with fists, bamboo clubs, rubber hoses. Shackling in stress positions for hours or days. The rope trick where arms are bound behind the back and progressively tightened until shoulders dislocate. Sleep deprivation, starvation, exposure to heat and cold, mock executions. The application of these techniques was methodical. Prisoners would be interrogated, refuse to comply, and then subjected to escalating levels of pain until they either broke or passed out, at which point they might be given a brief respite before the cycle started again. The U.S. military had prepared its personnel with the Code of Conduct for Prisoners of War, established in 1955 after the Korean War. The code provided a framework. Identify yourself with name, rank, service number, and date of birth, but resist giving any further information. Don't accept parole or special favors. Don't make propaganda statements. If forced to participate in enemy propaganda efforts, resist to the utmost of your ability. The code recognized that every person has a breaking point, but it set a standard of resistance. In practice, maintaining this standard under systematic torture was extraordinarily difficult. Many prisoners did eventually make statements or sign confessions, often after weeks or months of abuse, then lived with the guilt and shame of having done so, even though they had resisted far beyond what most people could endure. The camps operated on a psychological understanding that with enough pain applied methodically over time, most people can be made to comply with almost any demand just to make the pain stop, even temporarily. But there were acts of resistance that became legendary. And the most famous is Commander Jeremiah Denton, a U.S. Navy pilot shot down in 1965 and held until 1973. In 1966, Denton was paraded in front of television cameras for a North Vietnamese propaganda film. He was to tell the world that American prisoners were being treated humanely, that the war was unjust, and that he supported the North Vietnamese cause. Denton appeared on camera, haggard, obviously under duress. He answered questions with carefully worded evasions, but he couldn't refuse to participate entirely without inviting more torture. So he did something remarkable. While the camera rolled, Denton blinked his eyes in a deliberate pattern. Long blink, short, 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 long, short, 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 long, 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 short, long, short, long, short, short. TORTURE Morse code. American intelligence analysts reviewing the footage caught the signal. For the first time, there was undeniable proof broadcast to the world that American POWs were being tortured, despite North Vietnamese claims to the contrary. Denton's act of resistance was brilliant because it was subtle enough not to be detected by his captors in the moment, but clear enough to be deciphered by analysts who were looking for any sign or signal from prisoners. It confirmed what was suspected but hard to prove. The POW camps were not lenient, they were instruments of torture and coercion. Denton spent nearly 8 years as a prisoner. He endured repeated torture, long stretches in solitary confinement, malnutrition, and disease. When he was finally released in 1973 during Operation Homecoming, he stepped off the plane and gave a short statement that captured the experience. "We are honored to have had the opportunity to serve our country under difficult circumstances. We are profoundly grateful to our Commander-in-Chief and to our nation for this day. God bless America." His voice was steady, but the cost of those years was written on every prisoner who came home. Another high-profile prisoner was Lieutenant Commander John McCain, shot down in 1967 during a bombing run over Hanoi. McCain's father was a high-ranking admiral, which made him a valuable propaganda target. He was severely injured during ejection, breaking both arms and a leg. When he landed in a lake in Hanoi, he was dragged out by civilians who beat him, broke his shoulder with a rifle butt, and bayoneted him. He was taken to a hospital, but medical care was minimal and contingent on cooperation. The North Vietnamese offered McCain early release, a propaganda coup since he was the son of an admiral. But under the Code of Conduct, prisoners were to be released in the order they were captured, and McCain had only been a prisoner for a relatively short time. Accepting early release would violate the code and damage morale among other prisoners. McCain refused. He was subsequently subjected to severe torture, beatings every 2 hours, rope bindings, repeated interrogations. He was held for 5.5 years in total, much of it in solitary confinement. The resistance McCain and others showed required a particular kind of courage. It wasn't the acute courage of a firefight, which is intense but brief. It was the chronic courage of enduring suffering with no end in sight, maintaining your sense of self and your loyalty to comrades when every incentive structure pushed you toward collaboration, even in small ways. And when prisoners did break, as many eventually did under sufficient torture, they were often consumed by guilt despite the fact that their resistance had gone far beyond what could reasonably be expected of any human being. The POW camps also developed a culture of covert resistance and communication. Prisoners would tap on walls using a code to communicate with each other despite being in solitary confinement. They would pass notes hidden in clothing during rare moments of contact. They would memorize the names of other prisoners to ensure accountability if someone died in captivity. They constructed a clandestine chain of command so that even in isolation, there was some sense of unit cohesion and collective resistance. This internal resistance network meant that when North Vietnamese interrogators tried to isolate and break individuals, those individuals were not entirely alone. They knew other prisoners were resisting too. They could receive guidance from senior officers about how to handle interrogations, what to resist most stubbornly, and where limited compliance might be acceptable if it prevented permanent injury or death. The tapping code became a lifeline, a way of maintaining sanity and solidarity in a system designed to destroy both. The strategic intent behind the POW torture program extended beyond immediate intelligence gathering. North Vietnam understood that returning prisoners would become symbols. If those prisoners came home broken, bitter toward the U.S. government, and vocal in their opposition to the war, they would be powerful anti-war advocates. If they came home as heroes who had resisted, they would be rallying points for continued support. Thus, the camps aimed not just to extract compliance during captivity, but to shape the prisoner's mindset for years afterward. When prisoners were finally released in 1973 as part of the peace agreement, the stories they brought back confirmed years of suspicion and rumor. The images of emaciated men descending from planes, many with permanent injuries, visible scars, and the psychological weight of years of torture, crystallized for the American public just how brutal the conflict had been on every level. These were not just soldiers who had seen combat. They were men who had endured systematic cruelty designed to break their minds. The POW experience also fed into the broader psychological toll of the war. For every soldier who was captured, thousands more lived with the fear of capture. The knowledge that being shot down or overrun didn't just mean becoming a statistic, but potentially years of torture and isolation, added another layer of dread to an already nightmarish environment. In some units, soldiers made dark pacts to ensure they wouldn't be taken alive. The possibility of capture was a specter that haunted every mission behind enemy lines. Now let's zoom out and look at the cumulative legacy of these three tactical pillars: the guerrilla doctrine, the trap network, and the psychological warfare of POW camps. What did they collectively create? A 360-degree battlefield where threat was omnipresent and victory was undefined. Traditional warfare has clear metrics: territory captured, enemy formations destroyed, capitals occupied. Vietnam offered none of that clarity. You could secure a village in the morning and lose it by nightfall. You could sweep a valley and kill every guerrilla you found, and 2 weeks later the valley was contested again. You could fly thousands of bombing missions, conduct major offensives like Operation Cedar Falls or Tet offensive countermeasures, and still find yourself no closer to anything that looked like victory. The war became a brutal stalemate where the United States could prevent North Vietnamese conventional conquest, but couldn't translate military success into political stability. For the soldiers on the ground, this created a crisis of meaning. If you can't measure success, if securing ground doesn't mean you've won, if every patrol feels like Russian roulette, then what is the purpose of the sacrifice? This question gnawed at unit cohesion and individual morale. The answers that sustained soldiers in previous wars were defeating tyranny, were liberating occupied territory, were defending clear national interests. Those answers felt increasingly hollow in the context of Vietnam's complexity. The result was an epidemic of psychological trauma. What we now call post-traumatic stress disorder was referred to then as shell shock or combat fatigue, and its prevalence among Vietnam veterans was staggering. Soldiers came home from a war zone where they could trust no one, where children might carry grenades, where the ground itself exploded without warning, and they were expected to reintegrate into civilian life with minimal support. Many couldn't. Rates of substance abuse, unemployment, homelessness, and suicide among Vietnam veterans were significantly higher than among veterans of other conflicts or the general population. The constant state of hypervigilance required in Vietnam, the inability to ever fully relax, the expectation that any moment could bring violence from any direction. These are textbook conditions for producing lasting psychological trauma. The trap network in particular contributed to a specific form of anxiety. The feeling that safety is an illusion, that routine actions like walking or driving could suddenly result in catastrophic harm. Veterans carried that anxiety home, and it manifested in startled responses to loud noises, difficulty in crowded spaces, intrusive memories triggered by smells or sounds similar to those experienced in Vietnam. The POW experience created its own category of trauma. Survivors of torture face a unique constellation of psychological injuries. Flashbacks to specific episodes of abuse, mistrust of authority, guilt over statements made or actions taken under duress, and in some cases a form of learned helplessness where the individual internalizes the powerlessness they experienced in captivity. Former POWs struggled with these issues for decades after returning home, and many received inadequate support from a Veterans Affairs system that was not yet equipped to handle the scale or nature of psychological casualties. The tactical innovations of the Viet Cong also left a lasting legacy on how asymmetric warfare is conducted. The improvised explosive device, the IED, which became the signature weapon of insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan, is a direct descendant of the Viet Cong booby trap. The same logic applies. Low cost, high psychological impact, difficult to counter without massive resources, and effective at slowing and demoralizing a technologically superior force. The tactic of blending into the civilian population, attacking and then disappearing, making it impossible for conventional forces to distinguish combatant from non-combatant. This became the playbook for insurgencies worldwide. The propaganda and psychological operations pioneered and refined in Vietnam likewise influenced later conflicts. The understanding that modern wars are fought as much through media and public perception as through kinetic action became a central tenet of military thinking. The Taliban, ISIS, and other non-state actors studied the lessons of Vietnam, particularly the idea that you don't need to militarily defeat the United States on the battlefield. You just need to outlast American political will. Vietnam proved that even the most powerful military in the world can be forced to withdraw if the cost becomes politically unsustainable at home. For the United States military, Vietnam prompted a complete rethinking of counterinsurgency doctrine. The recognition that winning battles doesn't mean winning wars, that population security and governance matter more than body counts, that cultural understanding and local knowledge are combat multipliers. All of these lessons were learned or relearned in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, many of these lessons were forgotten or ignored in subsequent conflicts, leading to repetitions of some of the same mistakes decades later. The psychological dimension, the recognition that the enemy's strategy specifically targeted the will and morale of American forces and the American public, led to greater emphasis on psychological operations and information warfare in U.S. military doctrine, but it also revealed vulnerabilities that remain relevant. Democracies with free press and short election cycles are inherently more vulnerable to wars of attrition and public opinion than authoritarian regimes that don't face the same domestic accountability. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese leadership understood this asymmetry and exploited it ruthlessly. Perhaps the most enduring legacy is the phrase, "another Vietnam," which entered the American political lexicon as shorthand for a quagmire, a conflict with no clear exit, where superior military power proves insufficient to achieve political objectives. This specter haunted debates over intervention in Central America in the 1980s, the Balkans in the 1990s, and most significantly Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s. The question, is this another Vietnam, became a lens through which policymakers and the public evaluated any potential military commitment. The wound Vietnam left on the American psyche shaped strategic choices for generations. So let's return to our central question. How did a technologically inferior force turn terrain, low-tech devices, and the human mind into weapons strong enough to erode the will of a superpower? The answer lies in understanding that wars are not won solely through firepower or technology. They are won or lost through the interaction of military capability, strategic doctrine, political will, and the psychological endurance of the people doing the fighting. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese made a strategic assessment that they could not defeat the United States in conventional battle. American air power, artillery, mobility, and logistics were simply too overwhelming. So they chose not to fight that war. Instead, they designed a strategy around their advantages: knowledge of terrain, support or coerced compliance from the rural population, willingness to absorb staggering casualties, and patience to outlast American political will. The guerrilla doctrine ensured that American forces could never bring their full weight to bear in decisive engagements. The trap network turned every patrol into a psychological ordeal and inflicted steady casualties at minimal cost. The POW camps weaponized capture, both as a tool of propaganda and as a source of dread for soldiers who knew what awaited them if they were taken. Together, these three pillars created an environment of omnipresent threat and existential uncertainty that ground down the most powerful military on Earth over the course of years. The genius of this strategy was its sustainability. It didn't require matching the United States in technology or resources. It required understanding human psychology, exploiting the political vulnerabilities of a democratic system, and accepting that victory would be measured not in territory held or armies destroyed, but in the slow accumulation of doubt, frustration, and exhaustion on the other side. The jungle was the weapon, yes, but so was time, so was fear, so was the gap between the resources required to occupy and pacify a hostile population, and the political will to sustain that effort indefinitely. American soldiers in Vietnam were not defeated in combat. In nearly every significant engagement, U.S. forces prevailed tactically. But tactics don't win wars. Strategy wins wars. And the North Vietnamese strategy accounted for dimensions of conflict that traditional military planning often overlooks. The fragility of public support, the psychological cost of sustained low-intensity conflict, the difficulty of translating battlefield success into political stability. Vietnam was a test case in asymmetric warfare that exposed fundamental vulnerabilities in how superpowers project and sustain military power. For the soldiers who served, the tactical realities we've discussed mattered at the most intimate and visceral level. They lived the consequences of strategic decisions made in Hanoi and Washington. They walked the trails, tripped the wires, saw their friends maimed and killed by